I checked the time on the microwave because my phone was face down on the counter and I didn't want to look at it again. 7:42 in the evening. The lasagna had been sitting in the oven on warm for almost 2 hours. I'd made it from scratch. Not from a box, not from a jar of sauce, from scratch. The way my mother taught me when I was 11 years old in her kitchen in Thunder Bay. Slow roasted tomatoes. Bechamel from butter and flour and whole milk. The kind of lasagna that takes the better part of a Sunday afternoon and makes the whole house smell like something worth coming home to. My son had said he'd be there by 6. His wife had said they'd try to make it by 6:30, maybe 7 at the latest. It was 7:42 and I was standing in my kitchen alone, still wearing the shirt I'd ironed that morning because I wanted to look decent for my own birthday dinner. 63 years old and ironing a shirt so my family wouldn't think I'd let myself go. I sat down at the table, got up, went to the window. The driveway was empty. The street outside was quiet, the way Barry gets in February, that particular kind of quiet where the cold keeps everyone indoors, and the only sound is the occasional car on the main road a few blocks over. I thought about calling. I'd already texted twice, once at 6:15 and once at 7, and neither message had been read. Or at least, no read receipt had come back. My son had turned those off months ago. I only knew because his wife once mentioned it in passing, something about privacy, and the way she said it made me feel like I'd been caught doing something wrong by simply wanting to know if my messages had arrived. I turned the oven off at 8 o'clock, covered the lasagna with foil and put it in the refrigerator, poured myself 2 fingers of scotch, the Glenfiddich I'd been saving for a good occasion, and sat down in the living room with no particular intention of doing anything except waiting for the feeling in my chest to pass. It didn't pass. It never really passed anymore. It just dulled, the way an old injury dulls in cold weather. You stop expecting it to disappear. You just learn to carry it differently. My son's name is Trevor. He's 34 years old. He has his mother's eyes. That same pale grey-green that used to make me catch my breath when she looked at me across the breakfast table. And he has her stubbornness too, though in him it doesn't have the warmth she always wrapped around it. His wife's name is Jolene. I have tried, over the years, to find something generous to say about Jolene, and I have managed it in small doses. She is organized. She is organized. She keeps a clean house. She is very good at saying the right thing at the right moment, in a tone of voice that makes it impossible to object to. She is also the reason my son stopped coming for Sunday dinners. She is the reason my calls started going to voicemail. She is the reason that when my grandson was born 18 months ago, I was not called until the following day, and when I arrived at the hospital, she looked at me from the bed with that particular half-smile of hers and said, "Oh, we thought you might be too tired to drive all the way in last night." I live 40 minutes from that hospital. I would have driven through a blizzard. I should explain something. To understand what happened, to understand why I handled it the way I did, you need to know what my life looked like from the outside at that point. I was a retired millwright, spent 31 years working in pulp and paper mills across northern Ontario. Came down to Barrie after my wife Helen died of cancer in 2019. Wanted to be closer to Trevor, our only child. Bought a modest house on a quiet street. Drove a 10-year-old Silverado. Wore the same 4 pairs of work pants I'd had since 2015. I didn't look like money. I didn't talk about money. That had never been my way. What Trevor and Jolene didn't know, what I had told no one, was that 8 months before my 63rd birthday, I had received a call from a lawyer in Vancouver named Philip, who informed me that my Uncle Frederick had passed away. Uncle Frederick, my mother's youngest brother. The one who'd moved west in 1978, started a small lumber supply business in the Fraser Valley, and quietly turned it into something considerably larger over the following 4 decades. We weren't close. Christmas cards, the occasional call. He'd never married, never had children. I hadn't thought about him much, honestly, and I felt a pang of guilt about that when Philip called. What Philip told me was that Uncle Frederick had left his entire estate to me, his only living blood relative on the maternal side. The estate, after taxes and legal fees, came to just over $2,300,000. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire for 45 minutes after that call, just sat there, Didn't cry. Didn't feel what I expected to feel. Mostly I felt the particular silence of a life-changing shape around you while you're still sitting in it. I didn't tell Trevor. I kept meaning to. I'd pick up the phone and then think, wait and see. There was something in me that needed to know who my son was before he knew about the money. Does that make sense? I had spent 3 years in Barry watching him slowly drift, watching the visits get shorter, watching his wife steer every conversation toward what I had, what I could contribute, what kind of help I'd be providing for their mortgage, their car payments, their talk of a bigger house and a better neighborhood. I needed to know what he would do when there was nothing to gain. What he did on the night of my 63rd birthday was not show up. He called at 9:15. I was on my second scotch by then, still in my iron shirt, the television on, but not watched. Hey Dad, sorry. It was just a crazy day. Josiah was fussy all evening, and then Joe had a headache, and we just couldn't get it together. We'll do something next week, okay? Maybe grab dinner somewhere. I said okay. Because what else do you say to your son at 9:15 on your birthday when the lasagna's already in the fridge and the scotch has already done most of its work? You okay? He asked. Fine, I said. You don't sound fine. I said I'm fine, Trevor. There was a pause, and then Jolene's voice in the background, low and hard to make out. And then my son's voice, muffled, like he put his hand over the phone. And then he came back and said, Okay, well, we'll figure out next week. Good night, Dad. That was my 63rd birthday. Over the next few months, things didn't improve. They got incrementally worse in that particular way where each individual thing seems small enough to dismiss, but the accumulation of it starts to press on you like water weight. Jolene began bringing up with increasing frequency the question of my house. The lease on their rental was coming up in the spring. The housing market in Barrie had gone the way of most housing markets in Ontario, completely and aggressively out of reach. They'd been saving, but not enough. Trevor had mentioned, casually at first, and then with less casualness, that a lot of parents helped out in situations like this. His friend's father had co-signed. His colleagues' parents had gifted a down payment. It was just what families did. I listened. I said I'd think about it. What I was actually thinking about was Helen. About the last year of her life, when she was sick and frightened and held onto my hand in that hospital bed with a grip that surprised me every time because I kept forgetting how strong she was underneath everything. She used to worry about Trevor, not about whether he'd be successful. She knew he'd be fine in the practical ways, but about whether he'd be kind. Kindness is a practice, she used to say. You have to keep choosing it or you lose the habit. I wondered what she would have made of Jolene. I wondered what she would have made of all of it. The breaking point came in March. Not dramatically. That's not how breaking points usually come, in my experience. They come quietly, in the middle of an ordinary conversation, and you only recognize them later. I had driven over for Sunday dinner, one of the rare ones they still held, more out of obligation than anything else, I think. The lasagna had been replaced by Jolene's meal kit from one of those delivery services, which was fine. I didn't expect anything, but somewhere between the main course and dessert that never came. Jolene set down her fork and looked at me with that organized, clean house face of hers and said, Miles, I want to ask you something directly, because I think we've been dancing around it too long. Miles is my name. Miles Corrigan. My mother named me after a great uncle I never met. We've been looking at a property on the north end, she said. 4 bedrooms, good school zone, nice yard for Josiah. But we can't make the numbers work without help. What we need to know is whether you're in a position to help, and if not, she paused just long enough for it to land. Whether there's any reason to keep paying 2 sets of bills. I looked at Trevor. He was looking at the table. What does that mean? I asked. 2 sets of bills. It means, she said, and her voice was still perfectly pleasant, the way very cold things are sometimes pleasant to look at before you touch them. That if you can't contribute, it might make more sense for everyone if you sold your place and moved somewhere more manageable, a retirement community maybe, something designed for someone in your situation. My situation, I said. You're 63. You live alone. You don't need a 3-bedroom house. There are very nice places. We've even looked at a few, just to have options ready. They had looked. They had already looked. I thought about that lasagna sitting in the refrigerator on my birthday. I thought about driving 40 minutes to a hospital room where I wasn't expected. I thought about Helen saying kindness is a practice. I did not say anything for what felt like a long time. Trevor still had not looked up from the table. I'll think about it, I said. And I meant it, just not in the way she intended. I drove home slowly that night. The highway was clear. One of those rare March nights where the temperature sits just above freezing and the roads are dry and you feel, for a moment, that winter might actually end. I had the radio off. I was thinking about Philip in Vancouver, about the number he'd given me, about the account I'd set up at a different bank from my regular one, the one I'd told nobody about the investment portfolio a financial advisor in Toronto named Sandra had helped me build over the previous months. Conservative, steady, the kind of thing a retired millwright from Northern Ontario would have precisely no reason to have. I thought about what Jolene had said, someone in your situation. My situation was this. I had just over $2.3 million sitting in an account, drawing a modest but consistent return, and my son's wife had just suggested, over a meal kit chicken, that I sell my house and move to a retirement community to reduce the burden I represented to their finances. I did not feel anger exactly. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was closer to grief. The particular grief of watching something you'd hoped wasn't true become confirmed. Trevor hadn't objected, hadn't looked at me, hadn't said, "Come on, Joe, that's not what we meant." He just looked at the table like a man waiting for a difficult weather system to pass. I had my answer about who he was when there was nothing to gain. The following Monday, I called Philip in Vancouver again. Then I called Sandra in Toronto. Then I called a real estate agent named Bob, who I'd met at a curling league 2 winters ago and trusted on the strength of that alone, which is perhaps not the most rigorous method of selecting a realtor, but had always worked well enough for me. I told Bob I wanted to sell my house in Barrie. I told him I wanted to move to Prince Edward County, down along the Bay of Quint, where Helen and I used to spend 2 weeks every summer when Trevor was small, where the light on the water in the evenings looked like nothing else in Ontario. I'd been thinking about it since she died. I just hadn't done it. I told Bob not to put a sign in the yard until I'd had a conversation. That conversation happened on a Saturday in early April, at Trevor and Jolene's kitchen table, over coffee that Jolene made very good, and served in mugs she'd clearly chosen to impress someone at some point. I told Trevor I had something to tell him. Jolene was there, which I had anticipated, and which was fine. I wanted her to hear it. I told them about Uncle Frederick, about the call from Philip, about the $2.3 million. I told them about Sandra and the portfolio, about Bob and the house sale, about the property I'd already put an offer on in Prince Edward County. A restored century home on 3 acres, 10 minutes from Picton, with a view of the bay that Helen would have loved so much. It would have made her loved so much. It would have made her laughed. I watched their faces. Jolene's was the more interesting of the two. There were several distinct expressions in quick succession: calculation, recalibration, and then something that tried to be warmth, but arrived about 4 seconds too late to be convincing. Trevor's face did something else. He looked up from the table, finally, after months of looking at surfaces instead of at me, and what I saw there was complicated. Shock, yes, but also something that looked, in that first unguarded moment, like shame. "Dad," he said, why didn't you tell us?" "I wanted to see something first," I said. He understood, I think, maybe not fully, not right away. But he understood enough that he didn't ask me to explain further. He just sat there. Jolene asked, quite practically, whether my plans for the property sale were final. I told her they were. She asked whether I considered the tax implications of the portfolio. I told her Sandra had that well in hand. She asked. And this was the one I'd been waiting for. The one I'd known was coming since the moment I sat down. Whether there was anything structured for Josiah's future, and respite perhaps. Something along those lines. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at Trevor. I've set up an respat for Josiah, I said. In my name, with him as beneficiary. I'll contribute to it on his birthday every year until he's 18, regardless of anything else. That's for him. It has nothing to do with either of you. Jolene opened her mouth and closed it again. The house goes on the market next week, I said. I'll be in Prince Edward County before the end of June. I drove home that afternoon through a spring that had finally decided to commit to itself. That particular April light in Ontario when the snow is gone and the trees haven't leafed yet, and everything is grey and gold and full of possibility. I had the radio on this time, an old tragically hit record that Helen used to play on road trips. The volume not too loud, just enough to fill the truck. I thought about what I was leaving, not the house. I'd never been sentimental about houses. They're just structures, they do or don't serve their purpose. I thought about the version of this that I'd wanted. The Sunday dinners. The grandson growing up knowing his grandfather, the ordinary inheritance of a family that keeps choosing each other. The way Helen used to say kindness had to be chosen. I thought maybe it's still possible, maybe not in the form I imagined, but in some other form. Trevor was 34, not 70. Shame is not a permanent condition. People can find their way back to themselves if they want to badly enough. But I also thought, that is not something I can want on his behalf. I can leave the door open. I cannot stand in it waiting for another 3 years. I moved to Prince Edward County in late June. The house needed work, the kind of satisfying work I'd been good at my whole life, the kind that shows you what you've done at the end of each day. I rebuilt the back porch, replaced the kitchen windows, planted a garden that Helen would have called ambitious, and I call therapeutic. Trevor called in July. Not Jolene. Trevor, on his own, on a Tuesday evening. He asked how the house was coming along. I told him about the porch. He told me Josiah had started pulling himself up on furniture, trying to stand. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest real conversation we'd had in years, and nobody mentioned money once. He came down with Josiah in August, without Jolene, who had a work commitment that weekend. We walked out to the water at dusk, the bay going copper and pink, and I held my grandson while he slept against my shoulder, and my son stood next to me and said, quietly, I'm sorry, Dad. I let things go sideways. I shouldn't have. I didn't say it's fine, because it wasn't entirely fine yet. I said, I know. And then, I'm glad you're here. That was enough for that day. Some things need to be rebuilt slowly. The way a good porch needs to be rebuilt, carefully, piece by piece, making sure each board is solid before you put your weight on the next one. The water at dusk out here looks exactly like Helen said it would. She'd seen photographs from the summers we used to come down, and she used to say, lying in that hospital bed, squeezing my hand with that surprising grip, she used to say, go there when this is over. Take Trevor and go there. She meant after she was gone. She was already thinking about what I would do after. I should have done it sooner, but I'm there now. And some mornings I stand on that rebuilt porch with my coffee and watch the light come up over the bay. And I think about what she would say if she could see it. I think she would say it looks exactly right. I think she would say she's not surprised it took me this long, and I think she would laugh. The way she laughed at things she found both frustrating and inevitable. And I would give a very great deal to hear that laugh one more time. But the light is there. The water is there. And so, carefully, slowly, is my son. That's enough. For now, that's enough. I still think about that lasagna sitting in the refrigerator. That's the detail that stays with me. Not the money, not the house, not even what Jolene said at that kitchen table. Just the lasagna, covered in foil, going cold while I sat in the living room with my scotch and waited for a call that came 2.5 hours too late. There's a version of this story where I'm bitter, where I use what I have to make people feel small, the way they made me feel small. I understood that impulse. I won't pretend I didn't sit with it some evenings out on the old porch before I rebuilt it, thinking about all the ways a person could make a point. But I've lived long enough to know that the people who let resentment do their thinking for them don't actually end up anywhere good. They just end up alone in a nicer house. What I did instead, and I don't say this to sound noble, because it didn't feel noble at the time, it just felt like the only thing I could live with was try to act with some integrity. That word gets used loosely. What I mean by it is simpler. I tried to make decisions I wouldn't be ashamed of when I was older. Sitting somewhere quiet, looking back, selling my house, moving to the county, setting up that respite for Josiah regardless of what his parents did or didn't do. Those weren't grand gestures, they were just choices I could stand behind. Helen used to say that the way you find out what someone is made of isn't when things are going well. It's when things are going sideways and they think no one is watching. I thought about that a lot during those months. I thought about what Trevor was made of. I thought about what I was made of. Neither answer was entirely comfortable. But here's what I also know. Trevor came down to the county in August. He came on his own without being asked, without an agenda that I could see. He said he was sorry. He didn't explain it away or qualify it, or turn it into something that let him off the hook. He just said it and let it sit there, which takes more out of a person than most people realize. It takes a kind of honest reckoning with yourself that isn't easy, especially when you've spent months looking at a table instead of at your father. I think he'd been doing that reckoning for a while. I think watching me leave, quietly, without anger, without a scene, did something to him that a confrontation never would have. When you shout at someone, they can shout back and the whole thing becomes noise. When you simply go, when you just pack your life up and build something new somewhere else without asking for permission or understanding, that lands differently. It makes a person look at what they chose and what it cost. None of this happened because the universe was keeping score. I don't think it works that way. It happened because people make choices, and choices have weight, and eventually that weight makes itself felt. Jolene chose to look at me and see a liability. Trevor chose for too long to say nothing. I chose to find out who they were before I showed my hand. Every one of those choices had consequences that followed naturally from them. The way water follows a slope. What I hoped for Trevor, what I would tell him if I knew how to say it without it sounding like a lecture, is that the thing that pulled him back wasn't shame, and it wasn't money, and it wasn't obligation. It was something quieter than any of those. It was the part of him that remembered who he wanted to be. That part hadn't gone anywhere. It was just waiting for him to listen to it again. The bay looks different in September than it does in August. Colder light, longer shadows. I like it better, honestly. It suits me.